I know, great. Yeah, thank you. I think I'll do some housekeeping and notes and then hand it over to Kevin. This session's being recorded. Just so you know, you should have gotten a pop-up, and that's primarily just for our own use and stuff. But yeah, welcome everyone to this session, Empowering Communities to Fight Climate Change. And see, we had a participatory mapping session earlier in the morning where we did a bunch of exercises, and now we're going to hear from experts from all around the world on empowering communities to fight climate change. So I'll hand it over to Kevin.
Thanks, Roshan. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am Kavin Narasimhan. I'm one of the hosts of this webinar. A warm welcome to all of you. Some of you are joining us despite the huge time difference, and all of you have taken time out from your busy schedule to be here with us today, and we owe you a big thank you for that. I'd like to begin this session with the question, what role do communities and citizens have in water resources management? As researchers in the UKRI-funded Future Dams project, Roshan, Sarah, and I have been working with stakeholders and citizens in Ghana using interviews, surveys, and computational modeling methods to explore the purpose, roles, and success of community-based water management. And today we have with us an international panel of experts to talk to us about water resources management, its impact on, and the role of communities around the world. They would be covering a non-exhaustive list of topics, including surface water and groundwater management, hydropower development, policies, tools, and governance strategies. So without further ado, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all our speakers and attendees from around the world and hand over to the chair of our first session, Roshan Adhikari.
Hi, thanks, Kevin. Sorry, navigating Zoom here. So we'll end these two screens. So yeah, thank you, Kevin, for the introduction. Our first speaker today is Henry Lepsengauer. Dr. Lepsengauer is the founder and CEO of Promoting Economic Pluralism, as well as the editor of the Mint magazine. He's been a practicing economist contributing to environmental policy for over 2 decades. So welcome, Dr. Lepsengauer, and if you have any slides to share, anything. Thank you. Perfect.
I do have something to share, and sorry. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm just going to switch that on to slideshow. What I'm going to talk about is more in the space of catchment management or landscape management, because a catchment is effectively a landscape, and how landscape or catchment is management is crucial for the quality of the water, the water resources available, and also in terms of the risks from flooding. And I've got this slightly obscure title, Stacking and Bundling, which you'll understand more but as we go through. But this is largely about how can you connect the people who are managing the land with the benefits they're potentially providing in terms of water management, but also more generally, so that resources can flow to those land managers. And so you'll see that stacking and bundling is about those linkages. And I'm going to talk a bit about a similar problem in digital networks that's been solved in a particular way, which we can maybe learn from. It is the case that this is about collaboration and hence community, but this one's more sort of about legal structures, institutions, that sort of thing, than about, say, building relationships, building common purpose, building understanding, which is obviously crucial for communities to collaborate. But this bit of the problem is more the bit after people have a common purpose around managing water, and they want some structures, legal structures, etc., that will help them institute that in a way that is coherent with the spirit of collaboration. So I thought I might just start with a topical connection, because what is interesting is that this issue of agriculture, food, environment, water, etc., is the one bit of the problem that of climate change that was missed out and was not really talked about at COP26. Energy was covered, transport, but this is the difficult bit, because it tends to be local, it tends to be about connections that are different, about management practices that are different depending on climate, geography, all sorts of stuff. And so it's a very difficult area to control from the center. And that is why I think community and local connections and relationships are so important, because actually you can only really deliver solutions, I think, at that local level. So what is said at the international level, it's very difficult to say anything really, because it all depends, the solutions at the local level. And this is just a sort of illustration, because it's about lots of different elements that interact in a complicated manner. And so how do you make all that work together in any particular situation? And I'd like to just compare the sort of current model with a potential future model of land management. Land managers being crucial in terms of catchment management and the impacts on water. And of course, at the moment, the current system is that individual managers, individual farmers around the world try and raise food, or groups of farmers, to sell into global commodity markets to consumers. And they're under a huge pressure to provide as cheap food as possible. And they're also subject to hugely risky markets where the price is changing all the time. So the fact that in doing that, they quite often have huge negative impacts on catchments and landscapes, polluting rivers, increasing flood risks, reducing water availability and so on, is not surprising, because they're struggling to earn a livelihood in a very challenging space, competing with people around the world, with, apart from the uncertainty of the markets, they've got uncertainty of weather, etc., etc. And suggesting a future system where, rather than seeing them as sort of food producers, people see themselves as land stewards, providing a range of so-called ecosystem services. And this is the bundling idea, that land stewards collaborate together to provide a collective set of benefits, which food is one of them, energy could be another, but also water, which is obviously key to here in terms of how they manage the land to provide more resilient supplies of water, reduce pollution into watercourses, reduce risks of carbon, but reduce risks of flooding, but they can also sequester carbon, increase biodiversity. And for all of this, there are potential beneficiaries. In terms of carbon sequestration, obviously there are beneficiaries around the world in terms of climate change. Water, the beneficiaries tend to be more local in terms of people who might suffer flooding, who might be trying to clean up the water that's being polluted and so on. And the big question mark is really, how do you link those beneficiaries to the land stewards? And this is where the concept of stacking comes in. If you can stack the revenues from these different beneficiaries, then potentially you've totally changed the nature of the business model for farmers so that they're stewarding land to provide multiple benefits with multiple revenue streams, some of which for food may be local, some international, and some revenues might be quite long term. I mean, if you're sequestering carbon, you have to do it over the long term, and same with water management. So you could potentially create revenue streams which are quite reliable and constant and long term, as opposed to the current revenue farmers have, which is uncertain, subject to changing international markets, changing weather, and so on. So how can you do this almost magic trick? Now, quite often this is conceived as payment for ecosystem services. And those are the sort of standard models that come from a sort of standard economic model. But they create lots of problems because basically different people want different ecosystem services. So you're into a situation of multiple contracts, maybe with different terms and conditions, different requirements. And one of the key things is contracts, which is the standard law used around the place to cover this sort of stuff, are very bad at dealing with uncertainty. To illustrate that, I use this idea of if you were providing happiness to your child and thought that actually building him a tree house would make him happy, you would enter into a contract to deliver a tree house, but you would never enter into a contract to deliver that child happiness. Because obviously it's hugely uncertain, the relationship between the tree house and whether the child is ever happy. In a similar way, entering into a contract to provide ecosystem services is a bit like entering into a contract to provide happiness. The relationship between how you manage the land and ecosystem services is very complex, very uncertain. And so people either don't want to enter into contracts, or it's very uncertain the contracts will actually be met. There's also the problem is if you've got multiple contracts to do the same thing, are you double dipping? Are you getting payment for doing the same thing twice? Are you actually doing anything additional? These are key issues in the payment for ecosystem services model. And last but not least, you may enter into some contracts, for instance, carbon sequestration, which might encourage you because of markets to just plant loads of mycanthus, a sort of monoculture of mycanthus over the land, which of course has very negative ecosystem impacts in many other areas. So there's a real danger that water management could go down, not play a role at all because there isn't enough money in that, whereas carbon sequestration, tons of money, and you end up with huge monocultures of trees, fast-growing trees, with hugely negative impacts due to this limited ecosystem model where there's a single service provided under a single contract. So the question is, what legal frameworks could be designed to support collaboration which pulls together all the benefits, has a holistic approach? And there you can look to digital. This is a digital network, and you have at the bottom various players who own bits of fiber and linkages and the software to run the fiber. At the top, you have various people who have benefits from that fiber. And the way they've stuck it all together is using a cooperative model as the sort of neutral host that bundles together the different digital assets and provides a coherent service to a range of different people who pay to use it. So there are multiple beneficiaries, and they are all members of the cooperative. And the agreements are negotiated through governance laws, not through contracts. It's adaptive and can deal with changing circumstances, learning over time, and have a common purpose. So it's a legal framework which is built for cooperation. And this is where I think the solution to linking together the beneficiaries and land stewards is with the legal framework of cooperation with purpose. And communities can be a key part of that. as part of that cooperative organization and have a say in ensuring that their interests and their benefits are covered as well. I'll stop there.
Super. Thank you so much, Henry. That looks really interesting. Something that is slightly outside my research area, but the sustainable revenue streams and stuff. Yeah, thank you. It was very interesting, very innovative, at least for me. A lot of people have joined since I last mentioned the housekeeping thing, so I'll shortly repeat that. Our session today is being recorded and it'll be made available through the festival social science outlets. But your audio or video will not be recorded. So if you unmute yourself to ask a Q&A but wish not to be recorded, please just let us know. Or you can just post your questions in the chat box down there. And that's being monitored as well. And the speakers, I'll give you a warning at the 8-minute mark. I missed that with Henry, but yeah, for the following speakers, I'll do that and that so that you can wrap it up in 10 minutes and we've got everything goes in time. And a short reminder that from 2:30 to 2:35 British time, so we'll have a short break there and move on to the second session of the panel. Having said that, our next speaker is Dr. Alice Moshko. He's Managing Director of the Bangkok-based Mekong Futures Research Institute and the Sustainable Futures Institute Australia, SFIA in Australia. He is an adjunct professor at Deakin University in Australia. His background is in environmental economics with a focus on transdisciplinary modeling in the context of natural resource management, development, urbanization, and climate change systems. So good to have you again, Alex. Off to you.
Thanks, Roshan, and thanks, Kevin, for inviting me. Great to be part of this little event, which is fantastic. So I will not talk directly about our community work. We work a lot in the Mekong region, but actually all over Asia. And one thing we are observing a lot is that, well, one thing goes often wrong, or very often wrong, with community-driven work, and that's what I want to focus on. And the example I want to use here is hydropower development, mainly because of your overarching or sort of an affiliated project, which is Future Dams, right? So obviously the underpinning or overarching, the elephant or the cow in the room, is that communities need to adapt to climate change. And in Southeast Asia, some of the regions are battling with really a wide range of climate change related issues. The problem is that climate change assessments underpinning climate change policies, but also a lot of community driven work, often lack the understanding of sort of macro level changes or development strategies, which leads to really big problems and often a failure of whatever is being invested in. So I guess the key point I'm trying to make with this little presentation is here that climate change and development strategies need to be compliant. Instead, most development strategies, like for instance, hydropower development, but also other ones like investments in, for instance, irrigation expansions and so on, they're often introduced sort of in a top-down. They're not really looking at what is happening there in terms of community level work. They're often driven by what we call single sector optimization. So if it's about food security in the agriculture sector, that's what they focus on. And they don't really think about, what is happening with poverty, with energy, with water, and so on. And very rarely this is done in a top-down fashion with a solid understanding of these very complex, intricate dynamics, these cross-scale ripple effects. And that's one of the main points I will talk about today. So talking about hydropower, and again, this is really one of the main examples, or potentially the most relevant example for development strategies in the Mekong, at least at the moment. Hydropower in the Mekong is really driven by increasing energy demands, which are, well, which are often inflated to allow for the second point here, which is kickback payments. So there's a lot of corruption involved. Yeah, well, it's a very old school, I think, approach, engineering-based approach to address one problem, which is energy demand, without really looking at the other consequences. And one of them is that obviously water flows are altered, and this is really very quickly, it's quite a complex issue. So there's changes in water flow, dry season flow, wet season flow. Really important is that extreme events like droughts, but also floods, are often amplified by the existence of hydropower or reservoirs. Then there's obviously impacts on fisheries. There's quite a few studies for the Mekong, and a lot of advocacy groups really jumping in for very good reasons. So a study we did recently for the Mekong River Commission said that the loss of fisheries is likely to be close to $20 billion, mostly because migratory fish will disappear. And sediments is something that has been recently declared as one of the main national problems in Cambodia, because sediments, well, it's complex. But again, from macro perspective, we're talking there potentially about something close to $7 billion in damages, just to get sort of the energy right. But most of these assessments are really done at a country or basin scale, exactly these numbers I just gave you. Right, so that's how most of these development strategies are looked at. So what we did, and this is not just to shock you, but so we did a participatory systems mapping exercise, actually a whole series of them. We did this quite a few years ago. This has been, well published, and we were interested in this water, food, energy nexus. So you see this partly here with the let me get this up. You have sort of water-related issues, energy-related issues, food-related issues, and then obviously we also looked into poverty. But one thing that came up among these critical notes in here is that of migration, very early on in the studies. And migration is something I will talk about on the next slides. What we did with these, among other things, with these mapping exercises was to develop an agent-based model for the entire basin. And I want to show you here some results too, and this hopefully will then logically link back for you to community level work. So the agent-based model is very disaggregated and really goes down to the household scale. And what I'm showing here is, for instance, for food security impacts of hydropower and climate change together. What you see here is in these ranges is that these are here years, so simulated over 10 years, 11 years. Here you see the increase of undernourishment in communities, and here the decrease of undernourishment. And you see that in the example of Laos, that for any of these years, in some of the communities, undernourishment actually increases a lot, while in the same year, undernourishment decreases in other communes. And you see the same is happening, but with other extents and other patterns for the other lower Mekong Basin countries. And this is really driven by migration. So this is something that you can also play with on our webpage down here. We're actually redoing the online tool, but this is sort of from one of the earlier versions. So here you see on the left-hand side, the food security situation for what we call the baseline run, but this includes, for instance, climate change, one of the medium scenarios. And here you see for sub-districts, in the color coding, the more red pigment, the higher the undernourishment is for this snapshot here in April. Obviously, when you run it for an entire year, the colors change quite a lot. with, here the highest problems being in Cambodia and the lowest problems in Thailand.
2 minutes more to warn. Sorry.
Okay, here you see for the sub-district level that, a lot of communities are actually improving, which are the green ones, and a lot of other ones are disimproving, where things get worse. And this is really about the migration, which you see here, which varies also a lot. The point I'm trying to make here is that if we want to do these assessments, then we have to understand that while a lot of these impacts of any of these development strategies are typically assessed at the basin and sub-basin scale, a lot of the effects, which is sort of here the third degree, and then the final consequence in terms of the behavioral adaptation, are actually happening at the village or commune and the plot or that household scale. So at the end of the day, and this is now hopefully linking back to the community level work, is that both of these elements, climate change and development strategies, need to be assessed in combination. And there's a lot of very complex feedbacks. So if we want to empower communities, I believe we should not just focus on climate change, and this is my main message, my takeaway message, because I see this happening all over Asia all the time. There's these climate change assessments happening. We're moving into the communities, trying to develop something with them, and then investments are being made to help them. But at the end of the day, there's maybe a year, 2 years later, a top-down decision being made by big development, and then suddenly people move away, and resilience at the end is not really improved. That's my main message. I know this was very short, 10 minutes. If you have any questions, then please flick me an email. Otherwise, you can visit our webpage. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, from one set of optimization trade-offs and synergies to another. Yeah, completely different part of the world. That was really interesting. Thank you so much. In interest of time, I'm going to maybe save one of my questions till our Q&A session, and welcome Professor Eric Ofusu-Antwi next. Professor Antwi has held the position of the Director of the Regional Center for Energy and Environmental Sustainability, RCES, since 2019, but he remains affiliated with several other universities in addition to RCES, and he was trained as a civil engineer, but his work spans disciplines, including integrated water resource management, which is more relevant to this presentation. So welcome, and I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Afternoon. Please, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Let me go to slides presentation. Thank you very much for the opportunity to make this brief presentation. Thanks, Calvin, for inviting me for this. I want to present to you a study of one of my PhD students on the unreliability of groundwater sources in the White Water Basin in the face of climate change and the way forward. So the White Water Basin is part of the overall Water Basin, which covers about 6 countries. We have Mali, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Cote d'Ivoire. And the White Water Basin is one of the sub-tributaries, but we are focusing on the Ghana section of the White Water Basin, which supplies a lot of water to the hydropower systems in Ghana, Akosombo Dam, and then the Corn Dams. If you look at the White Water Basin, it's approximately an area where a lot of agricultural activities take place, and that is the main livelihood support for these people living there. And they depend mainly on groundwater for their drinking water source, for their irrigation activities. And we have observed in recent times that a number of the boreholes in the basin have not been able to provide water in the dry season. And that is the reason why we decided to embark on this study to find out what is actually happening. So we're trying to model current and future groundwater demands under two scenarios, a climate change scenario and then socioeconomic improvement scenario. We did some remote sensing, and also we had to collect a lot of data, hydrological data, agricultural data, water use data. And then we are trying to input all this in our WIP model to be able to see what is happening over the particular period. So you'll see the various data that we collected for the remote sensing, and then also for our hydrological assessment. And we projected to model this from the period of 2020 to 2070 to see how unreliable our groundwater sources are. So if you look at our WIP model setup, we use the WIP model, which is actually the model that has been accepted to be used within the Volta Basin. And so we see various subcatchments of the White Volta that we are modeling. In all, we have about 9 subcatchments of the White Volta Basin, and each of them have various characteristics. We looked at all the water use demands within those basins, sub-basins, and then also try to look at where the sources of the water demand are coming from, whether from surface water or from groundwater. So we have actually modeled the reality of the situation there. So these are the basins that we modeled: the Daboya, the Nawuni, the Yapi, the Nasia, the Nabogo, the Yabaga, and the Palugu basins. So we try to do the calibration of the basin and then the validation also. And we can see the validation and the calibration results within this table. And this is the land use land cover map that we generated. You can see the areas that are highly developed and the areas that are very green. And you will tell when the results are presented, you will see that the climate change is really impacting groundwater resources in the areas where we have more of bare land than the green lands. Now, the climate change scenarios that we used are also presented here. So we have RCP 4.5, RCP 8.5, and then we projected all the way to 2070. We use a bias correction to downscale our GCMs and to see how best we can be able to come up with some scenarios. And we depended on time series of precipitation, maximum and minimum temperature, relative humidity from an ensemble of 15 general circulation models to be able to come up with our climate change scenarios. And then also we looked at our socioeconomic scenarios to be able to see how combining the two, because definitely population growth will take place and lifestyles will change. So when those happen in the midst of climate change, how is it going to be affecting the water utilization and then the groundwater availability as well? So shared socioeconomic pathways, then fragmentation, conventional development. These are the socioeconomic models and that scenarios that we also considered specifically for this assignment. So the results that we generated, we have projected the results here. We are looking at the various basins, sub-basins: Gambaga, Sicily, Kopon, Nasia, Nabogo, the main White Volta, the Moli, the lower White Volta, and then others. So when you look at this result, you realize that from the flow to groundwater, that means the recharge of the groundwater. We can see high recharge in the Kopon, high recharge in the Moli, and then high recharge also in the main White Volta. And these are because basically these areas have high vegetation. The Moli, for example, is a national park, and therefore you have a lot of forest cover. The same with the Kopon. But areas like Gambaga and Sicily are highly developed areas, and that is why we are seeing low recharge of the aquifers. And then also, if you compare the climate change scenarios, if you look at 4.5, RCP 4.5, for the reference scenario, that is business as usual. Business as usual for the reference scenario, you can see, for example, in the Kopon sub-basin, you see that in the reference scenario, we are having a very low groundwater recharge for 2070. Okay, but then if you come to RCP 8.5, where we have extreme climate situation, you see that groundwater recharge is increasing. So in the areas where we have high vegetation, the groundwater recharge will increase over the years, but then it doesn't happen for areas with low vegetation. And then we have the climate change and groundwater storage. So apart from the recharge, we're also looking at storage. And then the results we are seeing is that under a reference scenario, we are seeing good storage for Hopon, which has high vegetation, and Mole also has high vegetation. We have good groundwater storage for them, okay, in the reference scenario. And then when you take RCP 4.5, also you can see that the groundwater storage increases under increasing climate change activities. But then those with high vegetation, groundwater situation is improved. But then
just a reminder to wrap up in the next 1 or 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm almost done. And then when it comes to water demand, also climate change and unmet water demand, we can see that there is unmet water demand increasing in areas where our groundwater storage has actually depleted. So areas like Gambaga, Nasia, and then Nabogo, we have seen a lot of unmet water demand from their groundwater resources, just because of the fact that the loss of vegetation is actually impacting the ability for us to have good recharge and also groundwater storage. So this is the picture that we got throughout, and so we foresee that it is important for us to actually improve the vegetation of the area for us to be able to advert and also be able to stop the adverse effects of climate change on groundwater resources within the sub-basin. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, it was really interesting, a lot of information there, and yeah, very relevant to our ongoing work at Future Dams as well, although our work primarily is with surface water. And I'd like to remind everyone again that to put any questions in the chat box down there so we can get to it in the Q&A session for this one. And now moving on to the last speaker for this session, I'd like to welcome back Udita Sangha. Dr. Sangha is a postdoc at the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University. Her work focuses on integrating social and ecological dynamics within agricultural systems and developing systems models to support informed policymaking towards agricultural resilience in developing countries. She's got extensive experience working with communities and stakeholders in lots of diverse contexts, mainly focusing on climate adaptation, food security, water management, and sustainable agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. So welcome back, Udita, and off to you.
Sorry, Udita, you're on mute.
Okay, does this work? Just trying to see. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Roshan and Kavin, for inviting me to this event. I'm really pleased to share with you today one of my past projects that I did with water in India, and the project looked at the triggers that can enable sustainable groundwater management in semi-arid regions of Maharashtra in India. And we used a mental model approach, and I would like to use this presentation to highlight some of the findings that we found in this project. So just to give you a brief background about water stress in India, 54% of India faces water stress, which ranges from high to extremely high water stress. And most of the stress is concentrated around in the northern part, the western part, and the southeastern part of India. And despite this water stress, or actually because of it, the rate of groundwater extraction in India is extremely high as compared to other countries. So as you can see in this graph here, over time, the rate of extraction has increased in India quite significantly. And so the complex social, political, and the agroecological diversity that exists in India make the water policies, the development of water policies and interventions on effective groundwater management quite complex and difficult. So today in my presentation, I want to focus on a part of India, the western part of India in the state of Maharashtra, which is one of the largest states. And Maharashtra forms an interesting case study because it is one of the most drought-prone area in India, with droughts occurring almost once every 3 to 5 years. The state has about like 9 agroecological agroclimatic zones, which with the middle part of the state being much more water scarce as compared to the western and the eastern parts of the state. So the state also has about 60% of the population which is involved in agricultural production. And the state of Maharashtra has been implementing various policies to enable effective groundwater management. And one particular intervention was these regulatory structures for groundwater extraction. But according to research, such regulation of groundwater extraction has had weak social legitimacy, which according to which some of these researchers have the view that people who are in Maharashtra and who use this water view groundwater as a right and as a private good. And there is a perception that people or water users are short-term goal-oriented individuals who would be utility maximizers and would want to extract as much water as possible if it's available and accessible to them. So this is kind of the background that we wanted to explore more and to understand whether this assumption is really true or not. So we went with 3 main research questions. And the first research question was, we wanted to understand what are the beliefs that people hold around water sustainability. We also wanted to understand what are the actions people take and the different kinds of challenges people face with respect to water use and water management. And we wanted to understand how have these actions and challenges changed over time. We also wanted to understand how does institutional interventions influence these water management decisions. And through the exploration of these research questions, our overall broader research objectives was to develop dynamic mental models of these processes that influence groundwater use and management, and to also identify these policy triggers that can nudge people towards more sustainable groundwater management in the future. Due to the interest of time, I will not focus too much on the methodology, but overall, we explored 3 different agroclimatic zones in Maharashtra with varying levels of rainfall. We had the scarcity zone, the transition zone, and the assured rainfall zone. We did about 43 interviews. Well, these were long open-ended interviews where we spoke to people and got their narratives about basically the past and the present actions and challenges around things like agriculture, climate, institutional change, as well as water. We also asked people about their future beliefs about the future of water sustainability and also the solutions that can lead towards more sustainable management of water. We use these narratives to then do a qualitative content analysis, and the data from the content analysis was used to develop causal loop diagrams for each of these different agroclimatic zones, which are essentially the mental models. To highlight then, we had some interesting results here. So with respect to the beliefs and desires of people, it interestingly enough, we found, so this graph basically shows the code frequency, so the number of mentions people had according to the different kinds of agroecological zone. So here you see that people in the assured rainfall zones expressed more desire to extract more water as compared to those in the scarcity zone. And people in the scarcity zone, on the other hand, expressed a desire to conserve more water. This was related to how they view also farming activities. So more people in the scarcity zone believe that farming was an undesirable activity due to climate change and the agricultural risks associated with farming. And they wanted to move more to off-farm jobs, which was more desirable to them. People in the assured rainfall zone found farming much more desirable. We had some interesting, unexpected results with how they viewed the future of water state. So for example, people in the scarcity zone, despite a lot of the water stress that they face, did have a positive view about future water, where they believe that in the future, they will have more water sustainability. Whereas people in the transition zones and the more water secure zones had a more uncertain or a more pessimistic view about the future of water in that area. So we wanted to really unpack and explore this dichotomy between the desire to conserve more water versus the desire to extract more water and the different kinds of actions people take. So our mental models was focusing on that. So this is a mental model that we developed for the scarcity zone. As you can see here, we explored two main key factors, which is basically the extraction of groundwater and the conservation of water, and what are the different dynamics that occur within extraction and conservation. And what we found was that since scarcity zone is a rainfall dependent area, rainfall into the lack of rainfall led to an increase in drought, which led to an increase in water scarcity. An increase in water scarcity also sometimes increases the desire to conserve more water, which then led to people to have to conserve more water. But increase in scarcity also, on the other hand, can also lead to an increase in desire to extract more water because of their agricultural needs, which increases demand and also increases competition and creates water conflicts, which again leads to a more reinforcing feedback where there is more groundwater extraction in the area. When we looked at mental models of transition zones, some of the dynamics were similar to what we found in the scarcity zone. The only difference here now.
Remind you to wrap it up in the next one or two. Thank you.
I will. Yeah, sure. We found that people in the transition zone used more improved crop varieties, which kind of like led to increased food production and food security. With the mental models in a short rainfall zone, we had much more interesting dynamics that were happening. People mentioned in the past, so in the 1990s to 2000s, Maharashtra had these extensive NGOs who worked on watershed development initiatives. These watershed development initiatives led to collective, to formation of cooperatives and collectives that led people to have an ownership of these water stewardship programs and watershed development programs. It increased participation in management of water resources, including an increase in trainings, which led to increased knowledge on water resource management and had people do more conservation of water as opposed to extraction of groundwater. But now the dynamics between the increase in crop production, especially cash production, is now steering more people towards extraction of groundwater as opposed to conservation of water. So what are the key insights that we can gain from this project is that tracing the problems and histories of people can give us insights into how people's beliefs and actions are shaped. That can give us critical information about how people can be nudged more towards pro-environmental behavior. Also, the other thing is viewing people as consumers of a resource ignores the role of human beliefs, values, and perceptions that can underlie decision-making and sustainability behavior. And what it means for water management in Maharashtra. So we see through this analysis that the people do have a desire to conserve more water, and they want to do that, but there's a contention between their needs for food security and increase in income. But what we can, as policymakers, trigger is to find out these things that can trigger more groundwater conservation, and that includes things like improving people's participation, improving people having ownership of the programs, training and knowledge and dissemination, and also a collective mobilization which promotes conservation, as opposed to the supply-oriented programs such as like electricity subsidy, building of infrastructure, economic signaling, and market forces, which then triggers people to move more towards groundwater extraction. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got time, 8 to 10 minutes for a panel discussion now, slightly, since we're running slightly behind on time. So I'm gonna look at the chat box real quick if we've got anything.
I have a question in case we are still waiting for any questions. So yeah, I'd like to encourage our participants to pop any questions you have, either unmute yourself and ask the question directly to our speakers, or please pop it in the chat. But I'd like to start off with one question. This is more a sort of a reflection, and I would just like to throw it out there to all our panel one speakers. I would be interesting to hear your thoughts. So Henry's presentation focused on, the importance of exploring the agriculture, food, environment, health nexus system transitions. And then we had Alex, he spoke about priorities and decisions being driven by, a single sector optimization, and then the need for cross-scale, for exploring cross-scale ripple effects. And then Eric spoke about the need for improving vegetation, and then urbanization more broadly, understandably affecting groundwater recharge. And then Udita spoke about individuals seen as utility maximizing agents, and then groundwater seen as private rights. So given all this, I just wonder, how do we get communities involved in discussions and measures for climate change adaptation and resilience? So we did hear about the role of bottom-up institutions to an extent, and I also like the figure that Udita had on her slide. But I wonder if we should go back to the basics to be able to do it, let's say starting from tailoring the language suitably. For example, at least in South Asia and then in some of the African communities, I would reckon that communities may not relate to climate change as such, but they would be willing and keen to understand the changes, opportunities, and risks affecting them directly. So would it be like going back the measures, would it be like going back to the very basics of changing the language which we are using to engage the communities? So this is just a reflection come question to our panel as such, and be interesting to hear your take. Yes,
if
Alex.
I should start, just from, sorry. Yeah, so I mean, we are working in this field now for, I think, over 20 years. And to be honest, I never really had a problem with language. I had a problem with, presenting scientific evidence in terms of modeling, where things get partly very abstract. And sometimes they match community expectation and communities' mental models, and sometimes they don't. And I think what we shouldn't do is sort of take for granted that we are sort of telling the truth and we hold the truth. But at the same time, I also think it's not very wise and useful to assume that the communities know everything, because otherwise so I think we should try as a science community sort of move away from sort of this I'm the scientist, I know everything, and trying to sort of help the communities to understand the science and to reflect on the science, and themselves to discover what could be the possible solutions. And And I don't want to talk too long, but I mean, the other point I try to make is that there's this huge disconnect between this top-down decision-making and what is actually happening in the communities and how we often engage in the communities. And I think that's another role where we can sort of be power brokers that actually connect these different scales. And I should have made that clearer, but that's sort of these two things I think would be really critical if we really want to empower communities. Thanks.
That's interesting. Henry, did you want to come in?
Yeah, well, I might just say one or two. I mean, this is a huge question, isn't it? I mean, to start with, I suppose I'd say there's no such thing as a community, is there? We talk about communities. I mean, we all know communities are complex interactions between subgroups, different, effectively, class structures, historical conflicts, people having different stories about different groups in and out. There's all sorts of stuff going on. And of course, there's all sorts of probably structures and power structures and people, you know, in there. So before you start, I mean, that's a beginning start. And also, of course, you do need to understand what is their problem, you know, what do they see as their problems, and are there any problems you can actually link to? And you can't, obviously, you can never solve every single problem that people have, but you can maybe at least, if there are some problems that have a salience at the time that can relate to the climate change or whatever, and then talking about using the language they're using to how they describe their problem and building from there. So all that is absolutely essential, and of course needs a huge amount of knowledge, and you need obviously local intermediaries and people who are, you know, have a lot of intelligence and knowledge about the locality, etc., in order to work in that space at all. I would suggest, but that these are, I suppose, obvious common sense things.
Sure, yeah, two very interesting points there about positioning of science and then grounding the understanding, grounding the expectations, and working together with communities. Udita, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just want to say that in my experience working in West Africa and South Asia and the communities, it's the problem is not that people do not understand that there is a problem, or they do not understand the impact that climate change is going to have, because they are because these are people who are working in these natural environments. So they're really connected to the changes in environment even more so. I think like the problem occurs when they're making these decisions. These decisions are not happening in a void. These decisions are happening within an institutional structure. And so this, even sometimes what happens is, even if they want to make decisions which may be wanting to do more climate adaptation or like making more sustainable choices, it becomes harder to do that because of these existing structures which keep them in that lock. So I think it's more the responsibility toward dismantling these like rigid structures and allowing these diversity in decision making to allow that to happen. So that's my opinion.
Definitely, another interesting dimension. I would like to continue this, but we have more questions coming, and I'm going to quickly pick on. So there's a question for Udita from Chris. So thanks for the great presentation. How would you measure farmer reactions to groundwater conservation policies in the future, and could you build that information back into your model?
Yeah. Thanks for this question. I just wanted to mention here that this is a mental model, so this is not exactly a quantitative model. It is a pictorial represent, even though I use a systems diagram to represent the feedbacks between the various factors. It is not, it just represents pictorially how people are thinking and what are the different factors that are influencing people. So in case if there is a future adaptation to this model, where we bring in perspectives of how people would react to conservation policies in the future, it already has some of these dynamics of the previous conservation policies that happened, but nowadays are not so prominent. Like, for example, the watershed management activities and such. So yeah, the focus was not so much on quantifying and measuring it. The focus was more of understanding the linkages and feedbacks and dynamic processes that happen when people think about how to think about conservation or how to think about extraction. So yeah.
Thanks, Aditya. We have one more question for you, but I'm going to start off with the question Anton has for Alex. Alex, thanks for the great presentation. You mentioned that incomes from outside the communities are critical for adapting to climate shocks. How do you suggest to address water sustainability issues in these cases where communities are apparently not relying on water system for their livelihoods and resilience, especially if their water use affects other communities downstream?
Yeah, I had to read it 3 times to understand it, but because it's very late here. So to say something meaningful, I think, first of all, I think all communities somehow rely on water, no matter where they are. Sure, I mean, some livelihoods, like agricultural livelihoods, depend more on water inputs than other ones like industrial manufacturing and so on. But yeah, I mean, to answer this last part of the question is really to take a whole of basin approach. This is really something that, you know, IWRM and Nexus thinking and so on really try to convey, that if we only look at a subsystem, then we typically deliver solutions that fail. So looking at the entire basin is absolutely critical, where we, for instance, and understanding also the system dynamically. So for instance, one problem, and this is part of your question here, one problem we often see is that there is effects from upstream to downstream, and then people talk, especially policymakers, they see people being sort of static animals. And yet migration is a very real thing, right? So a lot of people that are affected downstream, they actually then they move upstream, and with them comes from, for instance, then, you know, malnutrition problems or poverty problems and so on and so on. So it's just complex. That's just, sorry that, yeah. I hope that answers your question.
I'm cautious for time, but we have one last question for Udita. If we can have a short reflection for that, that would be great, Udita. So it's from Debashi. So he asked, does the research bring about the influence of institutions in groundwater regulation, especially when Maharashtra is among the very few states that constituted a water resource regulatory authority, that is the MWRRA?
Thanks, Debashi, for the question. Since the purpose of this research, when we went with the interviews, we did not go with a set standard questions in mind. These were supposed to elicit what people think and what are the different elements that are in people's mental models. So when these free-flowing conversations, we basically took things that people perceive and think about. So the regulatory aspects of what groundwater regulation did not come up much more often in the interviews. But also, having said that, that also leads to a point that some of these regulations are not working, because when we're talking to people, there were extensive discussions of how some people are extracting a lot, and that creates incentives for other people to extract. So if I'm extracting water, if my neighbor is extracting water, why shouldn't I? But there was no conversations, or very little conversation about like, oh, but he might or she might be caught. So, or there might be some regulations on it. So that in itself is an indication of how some of these regulations are not working in the ground, in the field, in the villages. So yeah, that's basically my answer to that. But maybe there could be like follow-up research on that, which specifically looks at how groundwater regulation is impacting people.
Cheers. Thanks, Dita. We are running slightly slow on time, so it's 36 where I'm at right now. We'll get back started at 40, so that's about a 4-minute break. So yeah, feel free to turn off your videos and stretch, grab a drink, and then we'll start with Sylvia 3 minutes from now. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully, it's some time to relax, grab a drink, what have you. We're only about 5 minutes late and covered a lot of ground. I'm calling that a win. So I'm gonna move on to Sylvia now. I already love the acronym on this slide there, and I'm excited for the presentation. So Sylvia, Ms. Schroeder is a PhD researcher in the Institute of Geography at the University of Augsburg in Germany. And for her PhD research, she's investigating how human land use influences the vegetation-climate interactions in the semi-arid tropics, including identifying drivers of land use management and changes, as well as their impacts on the environment under ongoing climate change. Off to you, Sylvia.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. One of my focus topics of my research is how farmers can adapt to climate change and the seasonal arid tropics. And I investigate that based on the crop diversity of farmers. And I try to click. And yeah, my research area is also in the upper east of Ghana, where the majority of the population are smallholder farmers, and they depend for their food production on the rainy season in the summer. And of course, climate change also impacts these agroecosystems because the rainfall events are becoming fewer and heavier, and farmers experience longer and more intense droughts. And due to several reasons, but one of them is one of these reasons are that to adapt to these changes is that irrigation systems were established to allow dry season farming to secure and increase the agricultural production. And so my focus is to identify if this adaptation tool, irrigated farming itself, is resilient to these climate change risks. And one way to observe resilience is to understand or to increase the crop diversity, because diversification of crops can lead to pest suppression, disease suppression, buffer climate change risks, and to mitigate climate change risks, and also to increase the overall production. So I wanted to find out how the diversity in Upper East Ghana is of the crops, and what factors contribute to the crop choices of the farmers, and to then identify what drives and limits the crop diversification. So I went to Upper East Ghana this summer. So for now, I only have preliminary results because I just recently got back. And I did some expert interviews and community group discussions in 8 communities, and household interviews with 168 farmers. To get an overview of the crop choices and what drives these crop choices. So just as a very short overview, most of the farmers grow just up to 5 or 6 crops per dry season. But some farmers actually grow up to 18 crops. So there's quite a difference in these regions. And my aim was also to look at different irrigation systems. So in these regions, there are large reservoirs, small reservoirs, river irrigation, and groundwater wells. So for further analysis, I want to kind of differentiate or see if there's differences between these systems and the crop diversity. And the main drivers or decision-making factors that were stated by the farmers, how they decide which crops to grow, were based on that they are aiming for diverse nutrition, what they know how to farm, and what's allowed with their workforce and the infrastructure they have. As you can see at the peak here, main factor is kind of soil is on their farm. So they check the environmental conditions and choose crops which are don't need a lot of water and can grow fast which is essential for this dry season. And of course, they also check the crops, or they check how much income each crop would take. So further outlooks for my analysis will be to kind of link the last two slides, so the crop types and the crop diversity with the decision making, to find out which of these decision making factors impact or drive high crop diversity and hence the resilience. And I will also, I took some data on demographic information to find out if there are other outside factors that impact the crop diversity, to then make an assumption on how it can be improved. And as a next chapter with this next topic, I also took information on agriculture practices, where I then want to kind of make an assumption about the ecosystem services, which also are assumed to increase the resilience of these farming systems. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. Really ahead of time. That's super interesting. We do a lot of work in the Upper East region here in the Future Dam, so as you're aware. So I'm gonna say my question again for the chat if we've got the time, and invite our next speaker, Courtney Hammond Wagner. So Dr. Wagner is a postdoctoral scholar in the Sustainable Groundwater Program at Water in the West at Stanford. As an environmental social scientist, her research broadly aims to understand how we design incentives, rules, and policies to collectively change behavior and water resource dilemmas to improve community well-being and ecological outcomes. So off to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me. And thank you so much for organizing such a great event. It's really exciting to be a part of it and hear all of the great work that everybody's doing. So I'm excited to chat about my work in California, so with the focus on enabling climate adaptive groundwater sustainability at the local level. Let me see if I can, there we go. Okay, so I want to start by just laying out the challenge. So sustainably managing groundwater resources and planning for climate change, as we've seen through a lot of talks so far in this session, generally requires a high degree of technical expertise, sophisticated tools, and financial capacity. But at the same time, local level management of groundwater by groundwater users may produce more effective, locally relevant rules, greater community buy-in, and get us to sustainability and sustainable use much more effectively than top-down policies. So this leads to this question that I'm studying in my research is, can we enable local communities to engage in climate adaptive groundwater sustainability planning, recognizing that many of these communities that want local management might not have the tools or capacity to do so. So how do we get there? So I'm looking at this policy in California, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. It was passed in 2014. And I think it's an interesting mix to add to this conversation we're having today, because it's much more of an institutional conversation about the mix between top-down governance and local management. So this policy is rather novel in its structure. So it sets statewide requirements, but with local implementation. So it mandates, the groundwater is now regulated at the state level, which is new as of 2014, but the implementation of that comes through local agencies. And by implementation, that means that local agencies have the authority and power to define what sustainability means. They have to coordinate with others at the basin scale. They have to get data and reporting to support sustainable management, but they get to define those, what sustainability means, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And then the state supports them. And then importantly, this requires incorporation of climate change into the projected water budget for planning. So what we're talking about in California are all these yellow and orange groundwater basins on this map here. So it's a pretty large portion of the state. It's also the dominant agricultural regions. So this actually is a little bit of a switch in the question, so I want to rephrase it. it's really, can we mandate local communities to engage in climate adaptive groundwater sustainability planning? So this is sort of a different way of, can we get people to do this, and how can we support them? So I'm going to just briefly mention, because groundwater is a little bit different than surface water, as we know, but groundwater is expected to be shaped by climate change in both direct and indirect ways. So directly, we're expecting to see the impacts to recharge. So that's the replenishment, the infiltration of water, surface water into the ground. So we're expecting to see changes to the quantity of water naturally recharged, the duration and magnitude of it. We're also expected to see indirect impacts, mostly in the case of irrigation. So you can imagine a region that's going to get more dry might want to turn towards groundwater more for irrigation. More wet might have actually less demand for groundwater. So with this, when we're thinking about groundwater in the future, many of these resources are already overtapped, as I'm sure many of you know. And so climate change is really important to think about in terms of how we're going to have sustainable groundwater resources for decades and hopefully centuries to come. So what I did in this, or what I'm doing in this project, is reviewing the groundwater sustainability plans that are required by this policy, statewide policy, to be written at the local level to achieve sustainable groundwater management by 2040. So this is a few of these plans. It might give you a sense of the diversity just by the colors and the pictures that are on them. There were 43 that were submitted in 2020. There's another round that's happening now. And these plans lay the groundwork for achieving sustainability. And critically, they have to incorporate climate change. So they have to do it within their projected water budget, which is a rather narrow portion of the plan. But we wanted to ask, does that mandate to bring climate change into the water budget actually result in a climate adaptive plan? And we see a climate adaptive plan as being much bigger than having climate change in the water budget. And so what we would want to see there is climate change as a planning priority, where you have internally consistent treatment of climate change, climate-oriented goals. I want to see technical integration of climate change into planning, with accounting for local dynamics, uncertainty, and risk. And then we want to see improving climate change integration into future planning. So these are the elements that we think, we're talking about technical capacity, we're talking about financial capacity, being able to put in place a structure that takes that water budget with climate change that's required and builds it into a climate adaptive plan. This is one way that we could see this mandate is actually enabling local communities to to address climate change and integrate it into their planning. So I'm going to just switch now to some of the key takeaways that we're seeing of this work. So is this working, essentially? Are we seeing local groundwater sustainability agencies integrating climate change? So first, GSPs is just the acronym for groundwater sustainability plans. So first, the GSPs, these plans are actually integrating climate change as required by the policy that SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So in the sense that they're incorporating climate change into their water budget. So the Department of Water Resources in California provided a tool set that local communities are able to use in their agencies and produce a groundwater budget for a projected groundwater budget under climate change. So a groundwater budget is simply an accounting of the inflows and the outflows in a basin. And so on the right-hand side, this is an example of a summary table out of one of the plans where you see that they incorporated, they took these climate change multipliers and incorporated them into their water budget to account for the total inflows and outflows and change in groundwater storage that they'd expect to see under climate change scenario in 2030 and 2070. So they're responding to the mandate and they're engaging with climate change in their planning. So the takeaway here is, if you mandate climate change incorporation, these agencies will, for the most part, comply with the mandate. A lot of that has to do with being able to find the resources, the state providing those resources, both financial and technical, to enable that. But on a positive, only one of the plans we reviewed did not incorporate climate change. So most of them are. The however, as there usually is in these types of things, is that the plans aren't adequately accounting for the potential impacts of climate change. So here, what we're really looking at is capturing the uncertainty and the potential for multiple futures and sort of these novel extremes that we all know climate change is likely to bring. We just don't quite know what they're going to be yet. So none of the plans that we evaluated included multiple climate change scenarios. So in this same water budget that I showed you before, this is looking at 2030 and 2070 time steps, but it's one climate change scenario. So it's really sticking with this linear traditional planning mentality that we're going to know what the future is going to bring. We can plan for it based on annual averages. And we know that that's not going to be the case. Additionally, no plans included climate change scenarios with multiple future and water use scenarios. We know that those are going to intersect. And so this is a challenge. So the takeaway here is that these plans may not be planning for the full range of potential impacts, so like unprecedented drought, which we're already seeing. And so these agencies might need, the local level might need more incentives or support in order to do so. So last takeaway I'll give is that there's some mixed results with the influence of climate change on the plan's proposed actions. So these are the actions that are going to kind of rubber meets the road, achieve sustainability. So about half of the plans calculated a sustainable yield, this critical planning metric for how much groundwater can be extracted annually based on the projected water budget with climate change. A little less than half of the plans evaluated the impact of their proposed actions relative to this sustainable yield. And then finally, no plans, again, evaluated impacts of those projects and management actions under multiple future scenarios. And so we're seeing that there's, I'll just switch to this takeaway, we're seeing that there's an influence on climate adaptation beyond what we saw required by the mandate, but without exploring this uncertainty, we don't know if these actions are going to mitigate the full range of climate impacts. And I know I'm at time, so I'll just wrap up, which is sort of why does this matter? And it matters because this is a slide with a farmer and a well fixer in Madera County in California, is that this unprecedented climate impacts, unprecedented drought is already happening. So Matt Angel's already seen wells drop 60 feet this year, which is unprecedented. So if these local agencies aren't able to account for that in their planning, it's not going to be climate adaptive. So with that, I'll just say thank you. Wanted to add a little bit of a mandate to the mix and excited to hear your questions in the question and answer. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Yeah, it's like fascinating to me when we're talking about, going from Upper East region of Ghana to California, and the problems are a little different, but in so many ways similar. So I'm sure there'll be questions. So I'm going to move on to Anton now. Anton Erfels, Dr. Erfels is a water and food security specialist based at the National Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, CIMIP. He's based in Kathmandu, Nepal. He's got a PhD from Wageningen University, and he's got years of experience working with issues related to water and food security in India and Nepal. So welcome back, Anton, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Roshan, and hello, everybody. It's really a pleasure to present to you and chat with you about some of the research I've been doing. And as Roshan mentioned already, I work with the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, part of the CJR, and a lot of the research I've been doing has been part of the Systems Initiative of South Asia project, which aims to improve rural livelihoods. Today, I will largely talk about some of the last research, and I'll shortly walk you through some of the context and introductions and the frameworks we're using. And really, it's mostly what we've been looking at is planting time decisions and how they interface with water, and how we can understand farmers' decision making from a social ecological perspective. And I'll say a bit more about this in the introduction. And then looking at these planting activities and how they relate to production and incomes of farmers in the region, and draw some conclusions based on that. So as I think, yeah, Udita already mentioned, South Asia really is not just a climate hotspot, but also a poverty hotspot, as you can see in the map up here. And the research that we're doing focuses on one of the most poverty-dense regions of the Eastern Gangetic Plains, where generally rice and wheat, it's cultivated in rotation here. So in the same fields, people would plant rice during the monsoon season and then wheat during the dry season. And so for community-based water management, or how communities can manage water, it's really very important how to handle these cropping rotations in these largely agrarian economies in relationship with the monsoon. And the issue that we're facing in the Eastern Gangetic Plains is one that we generally see that we have very low yields. And partially that's because a lot of times the crops are planted too late. So that means that the whole rotation is pushed a bit back, and rice cannot fully benefit from the monsoon rains, and wheat, it's getting into high temperature. So whole system is a bit of a mess. And we know that for quite some time already, but still adoption of this improved early planting is quite low. So we use the social ecological systems perspective to try to understand this. And yeah, there's the key takeaway message, I think, from this perspective is that it's really important to, and other people have said this already, to understand that water management and water management for irrigation in this case is not really an isolated action. It really is a part of livelihoods of farmers, where they need to interact with water resources and many other systems as well. And that's some of the key messages I also have to take home, really, is that different types of subsystems, for example, tractors and the availability of machinery, for example, can act as a kind of control mechanism on water use, for example. And so we take these planting activities and study them as part of this general framework and between different systems. And so what we see is, and we've done, basically we analyzed through a mixed methods approach, large household surveys. We did different crop simulations on gridded climate models and such to really get a bit of a better understanding of these issues, but also went for participatory approaches to complement all of these more like big data type of analytics. And from the data, we see that this crop planting times here, for example, in the distribution, it's really spans across more than 1 month. So really there's a lot of variability in crop planting time. And understanding where this comes from is at the heart of some of this research. And in some of the work we've done is then to go into the communities and draw causal loop diagrams to understand and also then rank the different factors that affect the timing of the crop planting, for example. And in addition, that's what you see at the top here, but in addition, we also looked at those big surveys and added a couple of environmental variables like groundwater depth to check really what's driving these issues. And what we see is that while water is really critical, and we all know that the monsoons are driving the agriculture in the region, we, for example, uncover that there's an important thresholds, nonlinear relationships, for example, in the depth of the groundwater level before the monsoon, that can delay planting if the water is too difficult to reach for the pumps that are being used, for example. But also that other issues like availability of tractors to plant on time and prepare the fields and such, all can further delay those planting activities. So the social factors in that sense really are like a secondary but critical factor. So even if water is available, not always can it be used as wished for. And another concern that then I want to look at is, okay, if we can plant on time or follow different planting strategies, what does it mean in terms of yields? And for this, we simulated crop growth for different planting strategies in the region. And here in the top part, you see state recommended planting dates, for example. And in the bottom part, in the figure B here, you see if rice crops, for example, were planted at the start of the monsoon onset. And the key issue here is that not all strategies work in all areas. And for example, recommendations need to be adjusted in some places, but also planting with monsoon onset is not feasible everywhere. So really context specificity is very crucial. And also there's some kind of nonlinearities where you have distributions that suggest in terms of yield, that suggest that planting after certain threshold days, yields plummet very, very severely. And so it's really important to stay before that. In addition, if high yields can be achieved, we're working in an environment that have very small farms generally. So we looked at, well, what can we gain in terms of monetary income from high production? And here there's IBI values, for example. On the left side are large farms, and then on the right side, low farms, between values. You see that the response in income, and this is the poverty line, the dotted line here, is really very limited for small farms. So in addition to having these other social constraints, there's not necessarily a strong monetary incentives for the majority of farmers. And as other people mentioned already, really for this kind of water management issues, like Alex was saying, I think off-farm income opportunities are really critical to understand decision-making and how communities and farmers choose to manage water or invest in water management.
And just a 2-minute warning, gentlemen.
Great. Yeah, no, I make it short. I think we can wrap up a bit now. So yeah, I think the key take-home message, and let's not go into these issues. Here, this graph I wanted to show is that really two key things to consider when thinking about water management. And really one is scale, and how does the local scale interact with the global, more regional watershed type of scale concerns or household concerns versus general development goals. And the other issue is to link social systems, ecological systems, and certain thresholds and control mechanisms between them to understand really what's the maneuvering space, the flexibilities that communities have. And there's many entry points, and yeah, I think going into water management projects to better understand and see where the entry points are, where the issues lie, is really more critical. And with the increased data availability, this is increasingly becoming feasible. So yeah, it's an exciting time, but also challenging because of the complexity. So with that, I thank you very much. And yeah, I look forward to discuss later on. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. There's a lot of information, a lot of really cool work. Thank you so much. A lot of questions. Moving on to, I made an error there. I think I was supposed to be before you, but my Google Sheet just bumped, so I do apologize. But yeah, last but not least, we've got Pamela G. Caddick. She's senior social scientist, in the Livelihoods and Institutions Department at the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Greenwich. Research being published in leading water, environmental, and econ journals. She's been active in public forums such as the agricultural sector working groups and teams, advising the implementation of agricultural research for development programs in the West Africa region, and has field experience in numerous African countries, especially in West Africa and South America. So on to you. Thank you. We see your the presenter. I don't know what this is called. Not the slide.
You see the other. 1 second. Yeah, it often does this. Settings. Like that.
Yeah, this is great.
Okay, sorry. I'm not very techy with these things. I'm still getting used to it after like 2 years of working on it. Okay, yeah, so thank you for the invitation to present here today. So this is very much work in progress, and it's more at the proof of concept stage. So I'm going to present to you a framework that I've developed with colleagues at various institutions to co-create innovation in multiple use water systems for nutrition and social justice. So this is just a slide showing a little bit of some of my past and current research around innovation for inclusive and nutrition sensitive water management. So what I've observed in my experience is that there are very good examples on the ground in many parts of the world of innovations, taking place at the local level or at the sub-basin level of water management that, fosters good nutrition outcomes and also social justice. Like, for example, I can cite some of my experience in northern Ghana after working for many years, but probably not as many years as some people in the meeting, where we see, for example, good and bad examples of women engaging in irrigation design and therefore promoting the planting of nutrient-dense crops, and that resulting in good nutrition outcomes. Also, some other examples from Uganda on a study we have on time use and how women spend so much money fetching water, which is a reality that I guess most people are aware, like 1.5 hours per day, and them engaging in multi-stakeholder platforms to try to develop innovations or develop ways to reduce that burden, and thus freeing up time for food preparation, which will eventually lead to nutrition outcomes. Similarly, in the Peruvian Amazon, I work with indigenous communities that also participate in multi-stakeholder platforms with other sectors of society, like the mining industries, and try to broker deals to avoid contamination of the water courses so they can fish their traditional species, and using their indigenous knowledge bring nutritional food to their communities. So as you can see, there's a lot of really good examples on the ground. However, as many people I think today mentioned, most strategies still remain pretty much siloed and single sector and top down, which unfortunately results in failure to scale this type of innovations that create synergies among the different outcomes, and also reduce progress and the missed opportunities of, as I said, synergies between various sectors. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this type of figures that illustrate the multiple pathways that relate water resources and all the dimensions of water security with food security and nutrition. But as you can observe, there's multiple entry points to enhance the synergies between interventions in both sectors. However, the reality is, vary dramatically, not only across countries, but across communities, across basins. So it's very important, as again was widely mentioned today, that innovations are co-developed with local communities and also rooted in local governance arrangements to ensure that those innovations are owned by the communities. In many cases, multi-stakeholder platforms have shown to achieve positive outcomes in these processes. I think many of you are aware of the limitations of these platforms, but there's also have, under certain conditions, very good outcomes in these processes. So the objectives of this work is to develop and test a framework to co-create these innovations that lead to synergies between water security, food and nutrition security, and social justice in a process of bridging the water between decision makers across multiple scales and sectors. So specifically what the framework intends to do is to support these platforms by informing the innovation processes, and how it does that is through iterative cycles of transdisciplinary participatory modeling, which is very much in line to what we worked on this morning on the participatory mapping, but on the ground stage. And the idea is that these cycles will enable the community members and also other stakeholders to collectively identify the problems and come up with solutions or innovations that can simultaneously achieve these tripartite outcomes of good income, water security, food and nutrition security, and social justice. So this is what the framework looks like. I know it's a little bit too much to take on one slide, but I'm gonna go step by step. So if you concentrate on the first upper part of the framework, the idea is first to create a baseline of the human water system that we are concerned with. So trying to analyze and characterize the water landscape and its users, and how the human system interacts with the water system. And then in this initial characterization, also to develop food and nutrition security indicators, and try to quantify these water and nutrition security pathways. Now, the central part of this diagram, this is like the participatory process, social learning process, which the aim is to co-create innovations in these participatory modeling cycles. So I'm going to go into more detail in future slides, but just to show that the way we have is developed so far is to work around 3 cycles of participatory workshops. And the first cycle aims to enable through participatory mapping, it aims to enable the identification of issues of concern. Then the second cycle introduces role plays and also an agent-based model to try to identify the innovations to respond to those issues. And the third cycle, it's also another cycle of role-playing supplemented by agent-based modeling. And at the end, we try to identify options to formalize the interactions. So basically options to make it all sustainable or making sure that the innovations can be practically implemented on the ground. Now, the third phase, which is the bottom part of the framework, is what we decided to title a response. So basically evaluate what is the response to this participatory process, which oftentimes is ignored or forgotten. Not just say ignored, but forgotten when we try to, in this participatory modeling or participatory mapping efforts. And basically what we propose to assess is what is the effect of this engagement, this type of engagements on power relations and also on knowledge legitimacy, on scaling out and scaling up of the innovation that has been identified. So what are the conditions for institutionalization of the innovation, and also the response in terms of different types of learning. Okay, this is more on phase 1, but I've already talked about it, so I'm gonna go a bit quicker because I don't have a lot of time. Just to give a little bit more detail on the central part of the framework, which is the participatory workshops and participatory modeling exercise. So what we propose is to base this modeling on a type of participatory modeling that's called companion modeling, or COMMOD, which is a framework that has been used in other projects. Me myself, I've also used it in Ghana, also in the Upper East region, like many people in the call. And the idea of this type of approach is that it uses intermediary tools like an agent-based model or role-playing games. And the idea is to enable this shared level of knowledge and also a progressive building of a shared representation of the area where the people and the communities are working on. Now, the idea with the workshops is that the type of tools are largely pre-decided by the team leading the workshops, but the content of the tools is defined and iteratively adapted as the workshop progresses. And another important point is that we propose to make explicit consideration of power asymmetries. Obviously, when we try to bring in the same room people, that work at the district level, farmers, people from the water basin boards, then you might have, it's not like you might, you will end up with power asymmetries in the room, and that result in different levels of participation. So the process is designed to progressively bring individuals and organizations operating at different decision makers, different decision-making levels together. Okay, so this is a picture of what it looks like in practice. So basically here we have a group of farmers and stakeholders in Sevilla, in Upper East region of Ghana. And basically what they're mapping with different post-it notes is, land use, different land use types. And I'm gonna go a little bit fast. And this is what the role-playing game looks like. So basically, people are given, depending on the specific problem or the specific topic that you have at hand, we adjust it. But in this case, what we gave them the option of selecting their crops, selecting where they will put their livestock, where they will do other activities. And then we have like another stage where the regulators come in, and they can also, say, okay, we will put, this regulation here, or this incentive here. Is not just about regulations. So that's the whole nature of the role-playing game. Now, the idea is after we've done the role-playing game is to try and have all that information feed into a multiple agent computerized model and generate this type of visualizations and projections that can spur a discussion amongst the workshop participants. So basically the behavioral rules of the agents, the decision-making processes, the forms of interactions, all those are defined based on information from the role-playing games and also from the data collected in phase 1, which was the initial characterization of the water human system. So the idea with these maps is that we will show, distributional patterns on water use, income, food, and nutritional security, and also immersion properties at the macro level. Okay.
Just remind to wrap it up in the next minute.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just maybe just go to the very end slide. Yeah, I think there are some important lessons for transdisciplinary research that we've learned just by developing the framework itself. The idea, of course, is to find funding to test it on the ground. But the lessons that we've learned so far for transdisciplinary research are, first of all, that the iterative adaptation of tools and facilitation techniques is something that is very critical and that it has to be considered in the design of the process. The second one is that there has to be a common understanding of the objectives pursued and the approach used. Also, the co-identification of the issue is, I would say, is the most or one of the most important outcomes of this process. So just, sometimes people say, oh no, but they know what the problems are. Everybody agrees. Well, no, it's not that simple. Sometimes just something as simple as defining a problem, it's half, gets you halfway there. And the fourth criteria, which for me is probably one of the most important ones, is to be aware of the context in which research is funded and it takes place, which is very challenging when we're trying to do this type of transdisciplinary research because researchers are also a stakeholder. So it's hard to become detached and become a participant like any other in the workshop. And sometimes that prevents the true transdisciplinarity in these processes. So we have to just be aware of the role and the position that we ourselves as researchers play in these processes, which is very important in my opinion. So thank you very much. And for questions, get in touch. We would like to collaborate no more. Anything, just drop me an email. I have to leave very soon right now to pick up my kids from school. So sorry about that. But I would love to stay and answer any questions. But anyways, I'm always, my email is always open for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pamela. Yeah, like a lot of information, a lot of effort went into that work. It's obvious. So yeah, we can open it up for questions from anyone to any of the panelists.
Thank you. As usual, while we wait for the questions to come, can I lead with one?
Yeah,
I'm using my host rights here, thanks. So again, the presentation is very interesting, different angles to look at the problem. So, and it got me thinking, on the one hand, we have these optimization models, macroeconomic models, climate change scenario modeling, resource budget planning tools. And on the other hand, we have the likes of the mental model that Udita mentioned, and then the agent-based modeling that we use in Future Dams to explore community-based management, which are all very useful in capturing more of the bottom-up processes and dynamics. And then we also have the knowledge co-production and co-creation with communities that is both used to inform and enact policies as well as used to inform the modeling. I'm just wondering, has there been any successful effort in integrating these different forms of knowledge and evidence production methods without becoming a victim of meaningless reductionism? I would respectfully like to add that meaningful reductionism is okay. We can't really work around that. But what I mean is, for example, in the transdisciplinary participatory modeling cycles that Pamela was talking about in the transformative framework, I think role-playing and gaming, for instance, definitely has that potential. So my question is, how do we then integrate all of this evidence with national scale decision-making models that often underpin the policies which determine the mandates? So do you know of any successful case studies where they have integrated these different modeling methods to inform evidence-based policymaking?
I can say very briefly before I have to go that when we did that this type of modeling in Ghana a few years ago on a different topic, but it's also around water management. What came out as a result was the establishment of these mini sub-basin boards that informed work at the sub-basin full board. And the idea that sometimes, the delineation of the watersheds does not really sometimes reflect the problem. So these mini boards, what they were tasked to do is to kind of come up with issues and map those issues geographically in, what they called problem sheds rather than watersheds, because the idea is that to delineate the geography according to the issues rather than to the hydrological system. So that's something that informed the management of a sub-basin board as a result of this type of engagements. Yeah.
I am so glad that was actually a practical success story.
Yeah, I mean, it's still it's a humble impact, but it's an impact.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. I wondered if any of our other speakers had anything to add to that, or have a slightly different take on that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that response, because mine was going to be that I think your question is a really good one, and I honestly haven't seen a transdisciplinary study that has integrated across scales well in the way that you've described. And so I was sitting with your question for a bit, trying to think if I have, and if not, I think it's about integrating. It might not be integrating models, but integrating questions and layering questions such that you're asking questions at the relevant levels that speak to each other. It may be that, the modeling itself, there's different kinds of modeling, but thinking in terms of like an actual, integrated computational model of sorts may not be the right approach, but instead, more of I'm just sort of rambling on that, but I'd love to hear if others have seen. I have not seen a great model of that.
Yeah, if I may come in here, I fully agree with Courtney, and I think the way I would answer this, I think there's two issues to this, and the first one is that being a bit aware of the kind of science policy interface, that integrating of the models and the research methods does not necessarily mean that policy necessarily takes up these integrated approaches into planning. That's I think a next step where where a lot of the integrated work, even within a certain discipline, like for example in the climate change science, as Courtney was saying, there's a lot of work of integrating different Earth system components and coming up with results and integrating those already into policy is a challenge, and not even to mention to integrate the control mechanisms and feedbacks between human and natural systems. So I think this kind of better understanding how we can use the outputs of different models in whatever way they are interdisciplinary to make them tangible for policymakers, and have that as part of the research project is one key component. And I think the other thing is that integrating it, there's often an issue of incommensurable. It's getting too late, that the findings are not incommensurable, basically. And so, for example, certain kind of social conceptual models are not always possible to integrate into mathematical models, right? And so finding a level of synthesis and the process that relates to the policy, I think that's something that needs work here.
Definitely. Just quickly checking if anyone had anything to add to that.
I think Anton summarized everything I was feeling about this general topic very well.
There is a question in the chat.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Sarah?
Thank you. Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for the very interesting presentations. I would like to ask Sylvia if you got any insights into how much farmers' crop choice is determined by market demands and market access in addition to the farmers' preferences and other considerations.
Yeah, it's definitely an essential factor. So what I found quite interesting was that the prices were essential for the farmers, how much money they get for the crops. But it's very linked to the market demands because the market prices are so unstable. So sometimes they choose to grow many different crops in order to always have one that brings a lot of money in. So that's what I kind of try to call market resilience. I don't know if that's like I'm not an economist, if that's a no-go word or if that's a word you could use. But yeah, then so on the one side, the market demand is like really important, but also the market access, because there's like in the different communities I went to, there were different market types. So once the local market's on the community base, and then the bigger market in Bolgatanga, but then also the market women from Kumasi and Accra were coming. And then I assume you've heard of this issue that a lot of market women go to Burkina Faso to buy tomatoes there instead of buying them in Ghana because of prices, quality, and yeah, several other reasons. So it's definitely a factor that impacts the crop choices of the farmers on like what kind of markets do they sell to and how often can they sell it and how stable are the market prices.
Sylvia, I guess maybe to add on, I was wondering, did you like also hear, are there like any community coordinations in the sense of what crops are grown to maybe like, well, like how they coordinating with the neighbors? Are they like, what is it, are the farm gate buyers, for example, coming to the community, or are they thinking about like, if my neighbor's growing that, I might go for another crop to like price each other out, kind of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So it's quite so in some communities, not all of them, but where they also had like this kind of community discussions on the water use, they usually also had community discussions on the crop choices. So sometimes they had like the market women coming in and they would sit down together to see what would they like to buy and what do they need to grow. And then it's also kind of community driven because of this fencing issue. Because sometimes they were like, oh, let's all grow the same thing. Then we can switch each other up with protecting our farms from the livestock. And also with the kind of timing of the watering of the irrigation. Because they said like when they open the canals in small dams, for example, they would like the water flows through the fields and they just like bury little laterals to let the water flow into the next field. And if you grow a crop that like needs water at a different time or a different frequency than your neighbor's field, then yeah, you have just bad luck basically. So they do coordinate within the community.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Sylvia. We have one question to Courtney from Anton. Courtney, I wonder to what extent lack of technology options to more easily implement different climate scenarios into the planning process was a key reason for not considering them.
Thanks, Anton. I was just writing a response to you in there, so I'll just say it out loud. I think it's a really great question, and I think yes and no. So what was really sort of bizarre about not seeing multiple climate scenarios, but seeing climate change incorporated in almost all of the plans is that the state provided a data set. So they just provided like a plug and play data set that each basin could use. And they included 3 scenarios. So they had a central tendency, an extreme wet, and an extreme dry. And so most of the basins used that central tendency scenario. So they have the capacity to use that data set, but they didn't use the other scenarios, the wet and dry. But it could be budget constraints. Most of this was done by consultants, or just like the kind of planning capacity to deal with multiple futures. So I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, no, thanks. And so it sounds like actually technology did play a role for enabling the whole planning process, which is quite interesting. But then it seems that giving a better hand to actually implement it the way it's intended to be implemented is something to be worked on, really. Because it seems like it was taken up and they could use it, but they didn't do it the way it really was intended, maybe. Huh?
Yeah, I think that's why I'm struggling with the interpretation of it. I'm at that point of the research where, you know, there's a real success story and that this was done. But then what do you do with the fact that multiple scenarios weren't considered? Is that like a sort of cognitive problem or is that a technological problem? And could another mandate work there? Or does it need to be in the realm of capacity and planning? That's sort of what I'm grappling with now. So if anybody has an answer, let me know.
That's, I think, really good follow-up research questions for yourself as well.
Yeah, thanks.
The part of me just like thinking is like, you know, I mean, maybe it's obvious now that you presented it, Courtney, but then like, you know, to me, it's just like, duh, like, and if it's not happening in California, like where else would you expect it to happen? Like, you know, in terms of like water data and everything else. That's what like, yeah, I was thinking about, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I think that's why this is a really fascinating case study, because there is so much money that has gone into this process. And, you know, these are really vary in terms of the financial capacity behind these, you know, within each basin, which I think is a factor. But there's so much money from the state pouring into this process. And so, and this is like, you know, a tech capital that's really fueling a lot of this. So it's, I think that, you know, I've been really deep in the climate change uncertainty modeling realm, and there's so much there about how you could do really sophisticated modeling of future uncertainty. And then you put it into practice, right? And that's what we're seeing here is that, I don't want to say none of that is resonating, but you're not going to see that across the board. There's 1 or 2 basins that had that capacity, but even when they did have that capacity, it didn't integrate into the planning.
Yeah, I think that's a really a good showcase of how really technology can both spur kind of social change, but also the requirements for their use really can limit actual sustainability outcomes. And that kind of deadlock or difficulty that needs to be addressed for well-designed programs to work the way they're intended to. I think it's a very nice showcase.
Yeah. We are 8 minutes over, and since we did the morning exercise as well, I'm going to say one last question, and then we wrap it up with reflections from Gavin. If anyone has one last question. All right, going once, going twice. All right, Gavin, add you for reflections, and then we'll wrap it up.
I think we're good. So my reflections came across as the questions to the panels mainly. I was fascinated by, like you said, on the one hand, some issues that you would expect will be very different compared to the communities we have worked with to what we'd see, for instance, in California. But on some levels, the issues are same, but some interesting lessons here, interesting perspectives here. And of all, I think today I've had a much wider knowledge of how you can really think for and engage engage with communities when it comes to water resources management planning. So thank you very much to all our speakers. Thanks to our audience who stayed with us, and some of our speakers also participated in our systems mapping session in the morning. So it's been a really long day. As promised, we will share with you the systems map that we co-created, and hopefully the video recording as well will be made available through ESRC Festival of Social Science outlets. So with that, thank you so much again for all of your participation, presentation, questions, and insights. Thank you. Bye-bye.